Everyone in town had the same warning: don't take that job, she'll make you quit in less than a week. The last caregiver walked out crying. Some even laughed when they heard I'd accepted it. I smiled, because I didn't have the luxury of saying no. I was 19 years old, and 6 months earlier I'd buried both of my parents. Grief doesn't stop the rent from coming due. It doesn't fill an empty refrigerator. So, every morning I worked at a small bakery, covered in flour before sunrise. By evening, I walked 3 blocks to an old weathered house on the edge of town, where 82-year-old Margaret Whitfield lived completely alone. People called her bitter, cold, impossible. After meeting her, I understood why. The first thing she said wasn't hello. She looked me up and down and muttered, "You look too young to know what you're doing." I forced a smile. "I'm Emily." "I know who you are," she replied. "The agency sent another one. No welcome, no kindness. Just another reminder that everyone expected me to leave." The house felt as lonely as Margaret herself. The curtains stayed closed even during sunny afternoons. Dust rested on the bookshelves. The ticking of an old grandfather clock was louder than any conversation. Every evening followed the same routine. I cooked dinner, organized her medication, cleaned the kitchen, read the local newspaper because her eyesight had become too weak to read herself. Most days she corrected the way I pronounced people's names. Sometimes she complained that the soup was too salty. Other times she insisted it wasn't warm enough. I apologized every single time. Not because I'd done something wrong, but because arguing wouldn't make either of us feel less lonely. Weeks passed. The bakery owner asked me one morning, "You're still working for Mrs. Whitfield?" I nodded. He looked genuinely surprised. "I've seen 5 caregivers quit this year." "So have I joked. "I'm just trying to outlast the record." For the first time in days, I laughed. But life wasn't getting easier. Some nights I skipped dinner so I could pay my electricity bill. I never told Margaret. She already distrusted everyone. The last thing she needed was pitying me. Then one rainy evening everything nearly changed. I'd been running a fever all day. Every muscle in my body ached. The bakery manager begged me to go home. Instead, I wrapped myself in a coat and walked to Margaret's house anyway. She opened the door, looked at my pale face, and frowned. "You look terrible." "I've looked worse," I joked. "You should have stayed home." I smiled weakly. "And leave you alone with burnt toast again?" For a second, her lips twitched. It wasn't exactly a smile. But it was close enough to make me forget how sick I felt. The next morning my fever became so bad I couldn't get out of bed. For the first time since starting the job, I didn't show up. I felt guilty all day. When I finally returned the following evening, I expected Margaret to complain. Instead, she quietly asked, "Are you feeling better?" I stared at her. It was the first personal question she'd ever asked me. "I am now." She didn't answer. But she poured an extra cup of tea. She never admitted it was for me. She simply left it on the table. Small gestures. Sometimes those mean more than words. As the weeks passed, the silence between us began to feel comfortable instead of awkward. Then I noticed something strange. At the end of the hallway was one door that never opened. Not once. While cleaning one afternoon, I accidentally brushed against the handle. Margaret's voice cut through the house. "Don't touch that door." Her tone startled me. "I'm sorry, I was just dusting. No one goes in there." She wheeled herself over, locked it again, and slipped the key into her pocket. Her hands were shaking. That wasn't anger. It was fear. From that day on, I couldn't stop wondering, what could be inside one room that frightened an old woman more than being alone that night? I couldn't stop thinking about the locked room. It wasn't because I thought there was money inside, or family secrets. It was the look on Margaret's face. For the first time since I'd met her, she hadn't looked angry. She'd looked afraid. I decided I would never ask about the room again. If she wanted me to know, she'd tell me when she was ready. A few weeks passed. Little by little, Margaret changed. She still complained when I overcooked the vegetables. She still insisted I folded the towels the wrong way. But every evening she waited for me by the window. If I was even 5 minutes late, she'd glance at the clock every few seconds. One afternoon at the bakery, my manager asked if I wanted extra hours. I needed the money desperately, but accepting them meant I wouldn't be able to visit Margaret until much later. I hesitated. Then I quietly said no. That evening, Margaret looked at me and asked, "You could have earned more money today, couldn't you?" I froze. "How did you know?" "I may be old, Emily, but I'm not blind to the sacrifices you make." It was the first time she'd ever called me by my name. Not the caregiver, not young lady. Emily. For some reason, hearing my own name from her made my eyes sting. A few days later, I found Margaret sitting silently in the garden, staring at the sunset. "I used to think growing old was the saddest thing that could happen," she whispered. But I was wrong. I sat beside her. What was worse? Growing old, without giving yourself permission to live. She didn't say another word. But I knew those words weren't really about age. They were about regret. The next morning, I arrived to find the front door unlocked. Inside, a lamp had fallen over. Margaret was lying on the kitchen floor. She was conscious, but too weak to stand. The ambulance arrived within minutes. Thankfully, nothing was broken. The doctor said she'd fainted from exhaustion and dehydration. When we returned home that evening, she seemed quieter than usual. Without saying a word, she reached into her sweater pocket and placed an old brass key in my hand. "If something ever happens to me," she paused. "Open the room." The next morning, while Margaret rested, I stood outside the locked door. My hands trembled as I turned the key. The room opened with a long, tired creak. Dust floated through the sunlight. Against every wall stood canvases. Some finished, most abandoned halfway. Shelves overflowed with dried paint tubes, brushes, sketchbooks, and rolled-up drawings. It wasn't a storage room, it was an artist's studio, frozen in time. Behind me, I heard Margaret's voice. "I closed that door 42 years ago." She slowly walked inside, running her fingers across an old canvas. She smiled sadly. I thought if I stopped looking at my dreams, the pain would disappear. She told me everything. When she was 23, she'd been accepted into one of the country's most respected art schools. Her paintings had won local competitions. Teachers believed she had extraordinary talent. Then, only weeks before graduation, the man she planned to marry ended their engagement. He told her she cared more about painting than about building a family. She believed him. She convinced herself that chasing her dream had cost her the future she wanted. So she quit school, packed away every brush, locked the studio, and little by little, she locked herself away too. "I spent 40 years punishing myself," she whispered. "I don't even remember why anymore." I looked around the room. "So, paint again." She laughed softly. "My hands are too old." I picked up one of the brushes and placed it gently in her hand. "They're still your hands." For a long moment, she simply stared at the brush. Then, she made one small stroke across a blank canvas. The next evening, she painted another. And another after that. Soon, it became our routine. I'd finish my shift at the bakery, bring fresh paint, make tea, and sit beside her while she worked. I wasn't an artist. But I mixed colors, cleaned brushes, and listened to her stories. The house slowly changed. The curtains opened. Music played in the evenings. Neighbors who hadn't seen Margaret outside in years began waving as they passed. One afternoon, she looked at me and smiled. A real smile. "You know something?" "What?" "I used to think you were only here because I was paying you." She chuckled. I was wrong. Months later, Margaret finished one final painting. It showed two women sitting beside a window. One had silver hair. The other wore a flower-covered bakery apron. Golden evening light surrounded them both. Neither looked lonely. She handed me the painting with tears in her eyes. "You didn't save my life, Emily. You reminded me I still had one." A few months later, Margaret passed away peacefully in her sleep. The funeral was small. There were no long lines of visitors, no grand speeches, just a handful of neighbors, and me. After everyone left, I stayed behind for a while. For the second time in my life, I felt like I'd lost family. But then, I remembered something. Family isn't always the people you're born to. Sometimes, it's the people who help you find yourself again. Today, Margaret's painting hangs above my kitchen table. Customers from the bakery often ask who painted it. I always smile before answering. My family did. And every single time I look at it, I remember that sometimes the greatest gift we can give another person isn't money. It isn't success. It's simply refusing to give up on them when the rest of the world already has.